Okay, welcome everyone. I'm Shifra Bloom. This is Rabbi Sam Blustin, and this is a What is God podcast. So, welcome to this episode. I want to tell you right off why this episode is truly unlike any other and is personally really special for me. So, it's very cool walking into this building where we are. We're in the synagogue where I grew up. This is my childhood synagogue. And Rabbi Sam Blustin, do you go by Rabbi Blustin, Rabbi Sam?
All of the above.
All Rabbi Sam. Rabbi Sam is a rabbi here at the synagogue where I grew up. And so it's actually very cool because the last few weeks I was in Israel, and then I was in Spain, and now before that I was 2 months in Atlanta, which I haven't lived in Atlanta for 18 years. And now I'm here, and it's like I've been on this adventure the last couple of months of just retracing my steps and bringing back the pieces, and I'm on my way to Israel. So it was really special walking in here, and I've been looking forward to this interview in particular, not only because Rabbi Sam comes highly recommended, especially from like the young community here, but also because of my own history with this place. And this is a conservative synagogue, and so you're to be the first conservative representative on this podcast.
Very exciting.
And as we were speaking before, I was even saying how, having just been in Israel, you get a different understanding of like what it is to practice Judaism. Whereas I feel like in the States, sometimes there's like Reform, Conservative, Orthodox. And then what I'm realizing being in Israel is like actually your practice and your relationship to God and to religion, etc. There's as many quote unquote sects as there are people, as there are Jews for this particular religion, right? Because everyone is every day re-relating, and I know we're going to get to talk about that. And so I'm going to let you, introduce yourself, but I'm really excited to get your perspective. I know you do a lot of outreach, you do a lot of community work, and I know that you also infuse depth and spirituality and prayer into this conservative congregation, which is special to me, and I'll share some stories about that. But also, you guys, Rabbi Sam, so you can be a rabbi and you can specialize in like a million different things. And so Rabbi Sam was telling me that, literally he has this essay on his desk. Can you tell what this essay was actually?
Yeah, so in preparation for us talking today, I found the theology paper that I wrote my first semester of rabbinical school at JTS.
So cool.
In New York. And I was reading back through it, and I was like, oh, this is actually pretty good.
But wasn't it called The History of God?
Yeah, I think, the history of God, and really exploring the idea of how I saw God, at least at that point.
Right. Right. Yeah. So I'm just excited because Rabbi Sam is truly like in the practice of this spiritual relationship with God and bringing community together around that. And then also he's like really an academic around the subject too, and a theologian around the subject too. And so we're going to get a little bit of both. And so with that, if there's anything you want to add, just to introduce yourself further, and then I think it would be a really cool way to start is just, that theological evolution of your own relationship to what that, the history of God, and we'll go from there.
Great. And so wonderful to be on and to be exploring theology and God and all of those related things with you. I got into Judaism at a deeper level through prayer, and specifically the music of prayer, when I was tutoring kids in high school. And those questions led me to questions of, well, why do we pray? What happens when we pray? To who are we addressing our prayers? What do we expect would actually happen when we offer these prayers? And that got me into studying more, and eventually the path of becoming a rabbi. But for me, spirituality has really always been at the core of that practice. In rabbinical school, I specialized in prayer and ritual. I'm thinking
about... That's so cool. Yeah, prayer and ritual.
Thinking about the ways that we gather together, right. Both from a ritual perspective and a deep traditional perspective, and how we might really, I think it all boils down to how we might bring God more into the world in which we're in, and we'll explore that a little bit more.
Yeah, and I just want to relate to some of what you're saying too, because for me, I grew up here in Atlanta going to the conservative day school, and at least the American version of conservative Judaism at the time, in the early 90s or mid 90s or just the 90s that I was growing up and in school, it was not such a spiritual. There really wasn't. I mean, I think now maybe it's changing. I don't know. I'm not in conservative day school anymore, but it wasn't so spiritual. But I do remember, I was a spiritual kid, and so I do remember we would have prayer time, whatever, for an hour, a couple times a week in the sanctuary room, and I loved the prayer. And it wasn't cool. It wasn't cool to love the prayer. I remember we get our prayer books, our Sidurim, when we're in first grade, and this older boy we're waiting for carpool, and I was so excited. I got this prayer book, and my mom decorated it, and it was so cool. And I was 6, and this older boy was like, "You're gonna hate that thing. Oh, they're gonna make you pray out of it," And I didn't get it, and he was never right. He was always wrong. He was so wrong, because I grew to love it. And I would teach the songs to my little baby sister, and I would just be the only last kid finishing the Amidah, because I felt something. And anyway, and then long story short, in my life I went deeper into observance and then less into observance, but I was always drawn to the idea of prayer. And then when I got less observant, I was still drawn to the idea of ritual. And it was actually going deeper into ritual where I realized, then come back full circle, wait, my tradition offers so much specificity with ritual that is thousands of years old, and that is intentional, that is actually specific mechanisms to reconnect to that which we call God. So with that, I'll pass the talking stick back to you.
Just one more aside, since we're on that topic. I grew up in a conservative congregation in Minnesota, and was blessed to have an incredible cantor who really, she brought a lot of chant and other things not always into the services, but created space for those experiences.
Yeah.
But it also kind of vibed with me in the way that you were describing the spiritual nature of our communities, because so often it was rote, it was dead, It was an undertone, our communal prayer together. But I always had an inkling, felt that it could be more. And the first incredible prayer experience I had was when I was 16. I went to Alexander Mas High School in Israel, and happened to go to the one Shabbat we were in Jerusalem. I went to this Orthodox bomb shelter synagogue, which I later found out was called Kolrina.
I love Kolrina. Oh my goodness.
And I
that's so special.
I had never had a spiritual experience like that in my life.
Me too.
And it literally changed my life, because for the first time I had what I call a souls on fire
have chills
sort of spiritual experience.
Yeah.
Where the people there were just pouring their hearts out in song and melody. They were really a part of it, and I left that experience being like, I am going to figure out how to create this, whereas in the United States, somewhere, anywhere.
No wonder we had to meet.
It took me a lot of years to figure out how to do that and how to see those things.
Wow.
I started a minyan with Eliana Lights in New York. It was a Friday night minyan called Shira Badira. Singing in apartments. It was very traditional, but it was egalitarian.
Yeah.
But the idea was that we would just get together, and as long as the prayer needed to take, we took that time, and just this really beautiful group of people and souls and harmonies and melody coming together.
That's so special. Kolrina was where I would do Kabbalat Shabbat and go pray. When I was 23, I lived in Jerusalem for several months, and that was where I would go.
Such a small world.
Such a small world.
So I'll come back to that idea a little bit as I talk about my own theological journey.
Yeah. So then you have this experience, and then I know we're kind of fast forwarding, but you end up deciding to go to rabbinical school. Yeah.
So I was rereading this paper earlier, and it wasn't as disjointed or as difficult as I thought it might be. Now. 8-9 years later, But at that time, in that place, I really thought that I needed a systematic theology, a theology that could stand up and explain how everything happens in the world. And where I was at the time, and I still resonate with a lot of what I wrote, is I'm stemming from the Kabbalistic idea of the creation of the world, that when the world was created, there was nothing, and then all of a sudden the world, the vessels which were to contain the light of the universe shatter and break, and it's our job to repair, to find those vessels, and to repair that holiness, that godliness in the world. And kind of stemming from that, I realized that as opposed to what often we think in the West of God as is all-powerful, all-knowing, and all-good, which I believe is Aristotelian in its origins, that God actually is broken in Kabbalistic theology. That God doesn't have the ability to act in this world except through our hands. And taking the idea of imitatio Dei, of this, taking these godly traits and imitating them in our lives, we actually have the power to repair the world. And the way that I saw it was that God's presence in the world, which is called the Shekhinah, the dwelling presence of God, is love. And its wholeness. God.
I'm just gonna start crying because forgive me for the interruption, but you guys, I just might start crying because this is very meaningful for me to have the rabbi of my childhood conservative synagogue when I was such a spiritual kid and it felt so dry, and here he is talking Kabbalah and bringing the magic that I always wanted into the conservative congregation. It's so meaningful for me to be hearing you say this. So forgive me if there's just there's a tikkun, which a reparation, something happening for me. So please continue. But it's very special. Well, and I guess I'll just mention to them the story that I told you briefly earlier. But basically, that when I was 16 and my grandfather died, I believe it was a Reform rabbi, but nonetheless, the rabbi that was at the shiva, at the grief ritual. I asked him where my grandfather went, and I know that's not specifically what we're talking about, but it's another mystical subject, and he just had no response. And it felt so empty. And of course, Judaism does have answers to all of the mystical questions. And, some people might try to make them more systematic or not. But to be here and have you speaking into the mysticism that I so deeply craved and that I later found, but that I didn't find here, and to be sitting here and talking about it here is oh my gosh, I'm just going to be wiping my eyes while you speak. So anyway, forgive the interruption, but yeah.
I appreciate you sharing that, and the tikkun,
yeah, it's one of those tikkuns,
back, full circle in a certain way. But I did, and I do still in a certain way think that God's presence, that God's dwelling presence is love, not as a noun, but as a verb. God is the source of the love in the universe. And for me, that solved a lot of things, right? The problem of evil in the world is not a problem because evil is the absence of God. Evil is where we haven't yet brought that love and connection into the world. Yitz Greenberg talks about, post-Holocaust, that the Holocaust is always, it becomes the litmus test for what is a good theology or not, in that if it, there's a little bit of a crudeness in this, but if it can't stand up to the idea of the suffering of children being burned alive, then it's not a viable theology. It doesn't work in the world. It's irresponsible to bring that theology into the world. And so in that way it does work. In the absence of love, we have hatred, we have things which are places where God's presence has not yet been brought in. God's presence doesn't yet fill it.
And as you say, the way, if I'm understanding, the way God's presence is brought in this world, which is as I understand, it's the lowest world in Kabbalah. Maybe there's others, I don't know, but it's the fourth world, is through our hands and through our actions and through our physicality. Is that in my understanding?
Right. So in a halachic system, for instance, in this framing of it,
the legal system,
the halakha is not necessarily a legal system in that way, but it's a path and a guiding system for how we intentionally bring that love, bring that presence into the world. And so it's a constant reminder, it's a constant shift, it's a constant touching back to that place of, am I doing the work that I need to do? Is this bringing more love into the world? Are we bringing more connection into this world? It becomes a means to the revelation in a certain way, of divine presence dwelling in our midst. And the theology is meaningful, and I think it still stands up in a certain way. But I was challenged by some of the writings, I believe it was of Heschel, of Abraham Joshua Heschel. And for these types of theology, he would turn to the theologian, for the person putting them forward, and he would say, well, how do you pray with it? And to that I had no answer. Like, how does it apply to me? Yeah, well, we have all of these prayers. If God is a source of some trait in the world, and we are the ones who bring that in, what are we doing praying? Who are we talking to? What is on the other side of that? What's the point of all of these different pieces? Right. And so I sat with that question for a while and never really had a satisfactory answer. Over the next couple of years, and as I did more study and reading and really kind of lived life more fully, I started to let go of the need to put things in pretty boxes and to have cohesive theologies that work in every circumstance and that explain everything. One, because, and we can talk about this later maybe, Rabbinic Judaism in its origins was never about systematic theology. It always was about connecting to elements and essences of the oneness of God, but that so many multitudes are contained within that idea, different facets, different gateways, to use a Hasidic metaphor, of entering into to relationship with that which is larger than ourselves. Okay. And so I started to shift into a bit of a different space, which is a theology of moments. And I did write about it a little bit in that paper, where I called it their moment spirituality. But it's the idea that God can only be experienced through moments of deep connection and in moments where we feel like we're connected to something much larger than ourselves. And what's interesting is so often it's not actually found in a sanctuary, unless it's a special sort of community, or maybe it's a moment within a 3-hour service. And interestingly, it can be found so often out in nature, on a hike, or praying out in nature. There's an idea of Rabbi Nachman and Hibodedut, where you would go out alone into the woods in the middle of the night and just cry out to God, whatever words come to your soul, to your mind, you just speak them out into the world. And we can find them also when you ask people about their own most spiritual moments, in just moments of deep connection with others. Marching with thousands of other people at a breast cancer, running at a breast cancer awareness, walk. The Women's March, having those thousands and thousands of people all together, fighting for love and for justice and equality. Things like the concerts, where you have hundreds of people, just thousands of people singing together, and this transcendent, these moments of transcendence. The Piasetzner Rebbe, who was a Rebbe in the early 1900s, he wrote in his book B'nai Machshava Tova that that the idea is to build a consciousness of God, there's actually a different way of seeing the world. And we know that we don't always realize that we're in a spiritual moment until the moment is done. But that's by definition, that when we're in a transcendent moment, everything else kind of melts away. Time seems to stop or to fly by or to not even exist. There's a kind of an expansiveness and a fluidity of that moment. But the moment you start thinking about or processing what just happened, you no longer are in that moment. And so for him, we try to string together these moments and to build a certain God consciousness in that way. But I think for us in general, that idea that through good gathering, through good ritual, we can create these containers that allow for the possibility of deep openness, of vulnerability, of transcendent moments, a deep connection with that which is larger than ourselves, with each other, with our communities, with these spaces that we happen to be in. And those are ultimately moments of revelation, moments that carry us, that we see something, we feel connected to something larger than ourselves. And I think that's ultimately, religiously, spiritually, where I try to cultivate space as a rabbi.
Okay. Something that you didn't necessarily say explicitly, but that I'm feeling from what you said is almost like, rather than defining what exactly is God or who is God, what I'm picking up is like, maybe it's more that we have an experience of God, and maybe the answer is more experiential and known in a felt sense, embodied kind of way, rather than necessarily a systematically explainable, articulable thing.
I think that's right.
Yeah.
That for me, it's very much about God. We can attempt to explain God, but we can never explain God.
We can try. I try.
This is, when we say in Kaddish, Le'ela min kol birchata v'shirata, that God is above all praise and blessing. And yet that's exactly what we're doing, is we attempt in that moment to give words to something which is indescribable. We attempt to touch on some aspect or some fullness of something which is larger than ourselves, but knowing that we can never actually touch what is greater than ourselves. And really, this is the entire religious experience, right? This is the essence of the Torah, is a series of experiences of divinity in the world that our ancestors tried to put into words.
Right.
Right. Even the experience at Sinai is ineffable. It's this thunder and lightning, but they're mixed up.
Right.
And it's not really clear how much the people are there for. Is Moses, is God actually talking to Moses, or is he interpreting these thunders and lightnings? So we try to express through words experiences that ultimately can't be captured by the limited language that we have access to. Certainly in English, certainly in translation, but even in the holiness of Hebrew, we get close to something, but we don't quite get there.
So there's a couple of thoughts that come to mind. I mean, first of all, something that has been repeated in many of the interviews I've done so far is this idea that we can try and explain God, and ultimately it's not something we can do. And that's an idea that I've heard now in almost every interview, probably to some degree, to some variation of that, is that it's the beyond, it's the inarticulable. And yet we try. So there's two ways I want to go with this, and we can see where we go. First of all, I just want to bookmark this idea of ritual, because we've talked about prayer, but I would like to come back to ritual a little bit, because ritual was something that has been meaningful to me, and that actually brought me closer to the practice of Judaism. So I do want to talk about that if we can, but maybe first is this another question of, okay, well, we're talking about what is God, and you've said some beautiful things. I like to take notes as we're speaking, and we've talked about God as love as a verb, the indwelling presence as love as a verb, and the source of love in the universe, and evil being the absence of God. And then when we pray, having this experience of God and connecting to something bigger and having this experience in moments and bringing God down. We talk about all these things, but if God ultimately isn't really definable, really, the question that comes up is, well, then why God? And I think that would be really interesting to talk about with you, especially as someone who is really in the leading of communities and in the applicability of the practice and of God. Like, if it's kind of this thing that we can't really define in a world where we so badly want to scientifically define everything, why God?
Oh, that's a tough one.
I mean, I have my thoughts on it of like, well, it's kind of what I was mentioning right before we walked in, something that, and I don't know why I was thinking about this before talking to you, but it was coming up really strongly of like, so being a rabbi to me seems like you're a kind of life coach, you're a spiritual mentor, right?
Yeah.
And I've been a life coach. Before that, I mean, I'm a clinical herbalist, so even then it's a little bit like health coach, and just coaching people and for a handful of years now. And so I have a lot of colleagues too that are coaches, and we're health coaches and life coaches and relationship coaches and sex coaches and business coaches and purpose coaches and divine feminine coaches and like pretty much any kind of coach you could ever want. And then what was coming up for me was like, but why? Like, why do I want to be healthy? Why do I want to have money? Why do I want, like, for the sake of what? Where's the compass? And I was feeling into this thought of like, well, when I have a relationship to God, whatever that is, then I have a little bit of a compass of where I want to funnel my energy. Oh, now I want to build a healthy relationship so that fill in the blank. Oh, I want to have a healthy body so that fill in the blank. So for me, this why is like, well, it does connect you to something deeper. It gives you a North Star. It gives you guidance. And I feel like it puts things in place in this umbrella of values that really are intentionally set up to, well, like you said, to lift the vessels, to create more love in the world, and to create repair, and to replace the lack of love with more love, ultimately. Now I'm just kind of talking, but
I think it's a beautiful formulation of why God.
Yeah.
I think for me, one of the big whys is to, I kind of talked about this as we were walking in, is it God and religions in general give us meaning and purpose in the world. It gives us reason to wake up. It gives us a direction in life, and it really it helps us to step into who we could be as individuals, as communities, as global community. And I personally, as a Jew, as a rabbi, I think that Judaism provides the best framework for me it's the most aligned framework for me of really stepping into to who we could be in the world, that it takes me outside of myself. It reminds me that ultimately, as important as I think I might be, I'm a very small piece in the world. I'm a very, it reminds me to be humble. It reminds me that there's something larger than myself. It reminds me to give gratitude, to give thanks. It gives me a reason to say sorry and a path back after I've hurt someone.
Right.
It provides the structure for, I think, good living, good relationship,
Right.
And ultimately for deeper connection and the purpose that brings.
what I've been noticing in my own observations is that the people who I know who have like a sincere relationship to a loving God
Mhm.
tend to also have in their lives values around family and community, which are things that generally lead to more feelings of connection, which lead to better quality of life and more happiness, which leads to better health, right? And I notice this, of course, in the Jewish community, because those are very Jewish values in my experience. It's a very communal religion. And maybe this will take us into the rituals. But even like I was in Austin, Texas for about 2 years, and I have so many dear friends there. And the dominant religion there is Christianity. And a lot of my friends in Austin are like Christian spiritual life coaches. So it's there's many different flavors of, Christianity, and it's a very specific love-oriented flavor. And I noticed that also they too seem to generally have this orientation around family, around loyalty and commitment and truth and love. And so, that at the same time, what I'm also observing is that, and now coming back to Judaism, because that's what we know, right? There are rituals and practices in place that actually do have mechanism behind them. And so that might be a segue into that of, like you said, you're into ritual, and ritual to me is more of a new agey word usually in the way it's used in the mainstream. And you don't really think of like, ritual, you think of like, I don't know, it's not the word necessarily most people would probably use when describing like conservative Judaism. And yet it's actually very accurate. So can we go down that a little bit?
Yeah, 100%. I kind of up there right next to the Torah for me is the book The Art of Gathering by Priya Parker. It's kind of like a second Bible for me. I know it's a little sacrilegious to say. But I think it's it's certainly one of the most impactful books that I've ever read in my life. And I think it's one of the most important books that we can read and explore. Priya Parker is one of the leading experts in the theory of gathering, how we gather well. And she really, in a clear, beautiful way, breaks down kind of in a systematic, there's a theme, me liking systematic, things with bullet points and check boxes and that sort of stuff.
Yeah.
But she breaks down why certain gatherings are meaningful or transformative and why other ones fall flat. And it's very much rooted in this idea of ritual and ritual theory. And so for my thesis in rabbinical school, I actually wrote about applying gathering and ritual theory with her and a few other people, and applying it actually to prayer leadership, and how we build containers that have the possibility of deep transformation. Okay, so that as an introduction.
Okay.
I would say that a good ritual does a couple of things.
Oh, this is fun.
One, it transforms, it marks a moment of transformation. And it helps us to move from one place to another. The ritual itself is a liminal moment, which is a moment in which we're kind of neither here nor there. You think of it like a doorway, right? Once you're standing under the posts, you're kind of not in the room anymore, you're not outside of the room. But you're in this process of transition in some way.
Wow, the magic is back to conservative Judaism. It's so exciting.
So for me, when I am thinking about ritual, especially in Jewish context, I'm thinking about this idea of connection. As a leader, I want to create a container in which holiness can dwell within it, in which the participants feel a sense of openness, of groundedness, and of expansiveness, and of safety, so that they can open themselves up, they can become more vulnerable in the ways that they need to really step into whatever is on the other side of that ritual. So in order to do that, there's a fine balance. I think they're kind of like a bowl. You need to be strong enough, you need to hold the space strongly enough that the energy doesn't leak through it. I very much pay attention to the energy of a room, especially leading services. Where do we need more melody? Where do we need upbeat? Slow down? Where do we need grounding? Where do we need uplift? But in any ritual, the energy, the pacing of a space, that's the job of the ritual leader, is to hold it strongly enough that it doesn't leak out, but not so strongly that they fill in all the space.
Isn't that creation itself?
Yeah, exactly right. A little bit of tzimtzum, contraction there, but not too much.
Right.
Not too much, just enough that we.
The kav.
Right. The Gesher on the narrow narrow road.
Yeah.
So in any ritual, I think that's a really important piece of it, is thinking about how we hold space, the ways in which melody, in which pacing, in which how we stand, how the room is set up, the space is set up, what are the ritual objects that we use, how do I as a rabbi frame the ritual that we're about to do, I think is really, that can transform a space because it sets expectations of what's going to happen in the next, well, a part of that is also timing, the next 15 minutes, 5 minutes, 20 minutes, 3 hours. If we can help people to feel like they know where they are, to feel settled in a place, then hopefully we can open people's hearts up enough that they can walk out a little bit different, a little bit changed, with a little bit more understanding of themselves, of the world, feeling connected to each other in a deeper way, feeling inspired to go out and do something in the world. That to me is the theory of ritual, and how I try to approach much of what I do, whether I'm creating something from scratch or.
Right. Well, one thing that I feel really blessed about is that in Judaism particularly, like, we might, it's like we don't have to make up anything from scratch, even though you might create some kind of container that's unique for your congregation. Like, there's the letters themselves, the words themselves, the blessings, the prayers, the songs, the ritual objects, the Torah scroll, like all these things are so ancient. And for me, I think that's part of the power also, speaking of like feeling like you're connecting to something bigger.
Absolutely. But I think that the context is most powerful in how it's framed.
How you frame it, right.
And then what we bring into that space.
Yeah.
If you don't know that Kol Nidre's melody on Yom Kippur is the oldest music that we still have in use.
Wow.
Thousands of years old, that this melody that we still, Kol Nidre Vesare, that melody, like that lends something incredibly deep to that moment.
Right.
But if we don't know about it, then
it's not as
maybe we get some feeling that someone said this, saying this at some point in the past, but it's not quite as sharp in that way.
Wow. That's cool.
Yeah.
That's cool. So, if you want to also you were talking about your friend Eliana Light.
Yeah.
And, you were saying something about just bridging this gap of how we relate to God, which we've now spoken about and given a lot of answers to and also no real answer to, versus like this God that maybe you learn about when you're a child or something. And you said she had like 3 pathways of like, okay, here I am and I'm an adult now and I don't necessarily connect to this 6-year-old version that's taught of God. What do I do?
And so Eliana is a dear friend of mine, and I'm putting on the record that hopefully someday you'll have her on your show.
That'd be so cool.
She gave, I believe, what's called a JED talk, a kind of a Jewish TED talk, about this concept that she coined called the God gap, in which the idea is throughout our lives, for most of us, there becomes a gap between the God that we were taught about when we were young, or that we assimilated into our ways of thinking based upon the stories that we tell, right? Passover is about this God who swoops down and does all these plagues and then splits the sea. And we never have a conversation actually about that God when we tell the story every year at our Starim. Or the God that we kind of assimilate through our culture, right? This God, the Zeusy sort of God of, male with a white long beard in the sky with a thunderbolt. Right, but as a kid, it's hard to avoid making those associations unless we really talk about them with parents or with educators or whatever it might be. And so we grow up hearing these stories of a God which is very active, which sometimes is angry, which can act in the world in these incredible ways. And then we see that God doesn't act in the world in those ways, at least not obviously. That there's deep suffering in the world, that there are people dying all over the place. Sometimes it's more personal. When a loved one, a parent or a child dies, and we say, well, where is God in that moment? Like, how could God let this happen in the world? And that gap between what we believe God is or should be in the world and what we see of how God acts or doesn't act in the world can grow and grow over the course of our lives, and that can be deeply painful for us. And that can cause a lot of pain and suffering for us in our lives, because the story is so painful that we're telling of it. And there are three options in that moment of what we can do. One of them, and I think we see this a lot, is to say, there's no God in existence, there's no God in the world. If there was a God, God would do something, which already is kind of pigeonholing God as one thing in the world, right? That's why that rabbinic question of, well, what does God mean to you? When someone says, I don't believe in God, well, what is the God that you don't believe in? That's why that's such a good question, is because there's still an assumption of what God is that you no longer believe in.
Right. And then they say, well, I don't believe in that God either.
Right. And so one option, we see this a lot, is people say, no, like I can't do this anymore. Either God, I still do some of the Jewish things, but I don't believe in God. I don't pray, there's no point to it. Or they say, religion isn't for me. That's one option. The second option is to sit in that pain, to sit in the models and the relationships which don't work, and a lot of us do that. But the third option is to revisit our own theologies, or maybe for the first time to make those theologies explicit in our minds, to really interrogate the stories that we're telling of how the world works and what we believe about that which is larger than ourselves. And if there's one thing that I can give to anyone listening or watching in this moment, is the permission to revisit, to renew your theology, your relationship with God in one way or another. Maybe I'll end this question with this idea that our prayer books are not a systematic theology, but they're a series of individuals' experiences with God, which they've put into writing in hopes that it will inspire us to connect in some way. And because of this, our prayer books, the Psalms themselves, are full of names and descriptions of God that are elements and essences of the oneness of the universe. Kabbalah has its own version of that, which are the 10 sfirot, the 10 emanations, that divine attributes that we can access God, bring God down into the world through. And the idea is not that we agree with all of these things, or that we connect to all of them on any given day or morning or evening or whatever it might be that we're praying these words, but that we connect. I learned this from a teacher of mine, Yitzchak Smith, who's in Jerusalem. that our goal is to connect to one thing. We connect to more, great, but to connect to one thing, one theology, one idea, one element that we need more of, we need to connect to in our lives. Whether it's to bring down the attribute of healing and to connect into that, or of the idea of Tzur Yisrael, that God is a rock of Israel. What is a rock? It's not literally a rock, but it's a metaphor for groundedness. If we're feeling unmoored, untethered, we can call upon that name of God in those moments. We can meditate on it, and we can sit in it in that way. If we're feeling powerless, maybe meditating on the names of Gevura, of strength, or whatever it might be. That those, it's an invitation for us to sit in and to find whatever is resonant for us in that moment, which might be different than what you find resonant to you in that same moment, which is why there's so much. There's so many pages in our Siddur.
Yeah. Wow. I know that there's a lot more, we're talking about like the evolution of how people relate to God and at different times in history, and there's a lot more we could go, but I feel like this could be a good place to, wrap it together. And if you have any, last message or anything that you want to share, and then also just, it's quite possible, I imagine, that some people may be really inspired from listening to you, and I certainly am. Like, it's very inspiring to me to see a rabbi of a conservative synagogue bringing in so much ritual and prayer and magic and even Kabbalah. And so also if you would share a little bit of like, if people really did connect to you and want to be able to connect with more of your teachings, etc., where they could do that.
Great. So I guess maybe one final thought, I'll revisit a phrase that brought up and interpreted differently earlier, which is in the Kedusha, or the Kaddish, the idea of Le'ela min kol birchata v'shirata, that God is above all songs and praises and words. A different way of reading that is actually a purpose statement of what it is to step into prayer, whether it's through liturgy or individual prayer on our own. But the goal of prayer is to go beyond all words, to go beyond all space and time. And ultimately through the melody, through the word, through the imagery and the metaphor, to connect just into that expansiveness in the world, which is deep connection. I remember very quickly, I was once leading a service, a morning service in rabbinical school. And for whatever reason, the setup, the people in the room that morning, the container that we built together was just, it was so gorgeous. I got to the Shema, and like, it doesn't happen often, but sometimes prayer brings me beyond that place of words where like I actually can't speak. I can't make sound.
Wow. And
if I'm a participant, that's fine.
Right.
Because I can just bask in that space.
Wow.
But I had to get to the Amidah in order to be quiet. So I still had a couple pages of words that I had to try to force out in order to be able to sit in the lusciousness of that space. But ultimately, it's those experiences of deep connection, of transcendence that, no matter how we kind of get to, I think all of those moments are equally valid. And let's say all the pathways to God are divine or holy.
That to me, this idea of transcendental meditation is such a big idea, and what you just said feels to me like transcendental prayer. So may we all merit to have the experience of transcendental prayer.
Amen.
And deep connection. And for people, if they want to look you up, is there a way?
Yeah, so I am the Associate Rabbi of Havath Achim Synagogue in Atlanta, Georgia. You can find us online. All of our services are also streamed out over Zoom. You can find us. You can find us on YouTube for our prayer experiences. And
so cool. If you're in Atlanta, then come by, or maybe call ahead. But
yeah. Absolutely. But it's a blessing to be part of this community and part of a group of people that really are looking to kind of lift up together. And so
thank you.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for your time.
Absolutely.
Now I know why our friends connected us, and it's really special. Okay, guys. Well, that's a wrap for this episode. Thank you, Rabbi Sam Blustin, And this is the What is God podcast, so you can find it on Spotify, Apple. It's also on YouTube. If you want to see, there's a really exquisite library of books behind us in case you're listening to the audio. Go find it on YouTube. And whatisgodpodcast.com if you're looking for all the links and you just want it all in one place. I'm Shifra Bloom, your hostess. You can hang out with me on Instagram at Shifra Bloom. And you know, it's cool that Rabbi Sam was just talking at the very end about the Sfirot and these emanations and getting into some of the Kabbalah. Well, that's what I like to really talk about. And so I'm coming out with a card deck and a book on that sometime in the near future, God willing. So you can follow along with me and get news about that as well. And that's a wrap. See you next time.